Hello and good afternoon. My name is Ari Naaman. I'm with the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, and you are here for the Pacific Alliance on Disability Self-Advocacy's second Technical Assistance webinar, Funding Options for Self-Advocacy Organizations, Part 2. Now before we begin, I just want to start by doing a quick poll to get an idea of how many people are with us today. So we can get an accurate count, can you please share how many people are listening to today's webinar at your site? And we'll just take another 15 seconds or so to give folks time to vote. You can just click on one of the 5 options. Just me today, 2 to 3 people, 3 to 6 people, 7 to 15 people, or 16 plus people. And we have 87% people have voted, 93%, and we will be closing the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, thanks so much. So just to provide a little bit of background for those of you who may not have been with us prior to this webinar, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network is the leading national advocacy group run by and for autistic people speaking for ourselves. However, we're not just limited to autism. We consider ourselves a disability rights organization that emerged from and primarily works in the autistic community, but also works in the broader intellectual and developmental disability self-advocacy movement. Our work includes systems change advocacy, public policy advocacy, and leadership and employment-related programming. Recently, we were awarded a grant from the Administration on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities to set up the Pacific Alliance on Disability Self-Advocacy. The Pacific Alliance is a 4-state technical assistance group for self-advocacy groups in California, Oregon, Washington, and Montana. And as we see it, our goal, our job here is to be your resource on the various things that self-advocacy groups need to increase their capacity and go to the next level. If you're trying to figure out the 501c3 process, we're available to help you determine what you need to go through that. If you're trying to figure out how to become a more effective fundraiser, to have more financial resources for your self-advocacy group, we're available to offer advice on that, such as we are on this webinar. And we also have resources on a wide variety of other issues ranging from meeting facilitation techniques, organizing strategies, social media, accessibility to diverse populations, and many other issues. Like ASAN, the Pacific Alliance on Disability Self-Advocacy is a self-advocacy initiative, so it's run entirely by and for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And we're funded by the Administration on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. Now, at last week's webinar, we talked a lot about the various different ways of thinking about fundraising and the difference between one's mission and how one approached acquiring resources to accomplish that mission. On this webinar, we're going to take you through some of the various entities that you might be approaching and interacting with in order to request funding and talk a little bit about some of the strategies that work well for making those kinds of approaches. So just to take you through the first entity that I want to talk about, and it's in some respects the most common funder that nonprofit organizations work with, but one that most self-advocacy groups have had little to no interaction with, and that's the foundation funding world. Foundations are nonprofit organizations that are set up typically for the sole or primary purpose of making grants to other nonprofits. Their major role is to give nonprofit organizations money. And so they will typically have an infrastructure that's focused around finding nonprofit organizations they want to fund, evaluating proposed projects, talking to nonprofits about potential projects or measures, ways of assessing if a project is a good idea, looking at the outcomes of a project, and many, many other things. We have a couple of examples of foundations here, all of which ASAN has, at one point or another, received funding from. The Mitsubishi Electric America Foundation supports ASAN's Autism Campus Inclusion Summer Leadership Academy. And the ACI Leadership Academy is a leadership development program for autistic college students. Mitsubishi Electric America Foundation is very interested in integrated employment opportunities for people with disabilities. So we spoke with them about how we could build a leadership development program that would help make higher education more accessible for autistic students as a precursor, as a first step towards helping to build more integrated employment opportunities. The HSC Foundation has supported our Autism Campus Inclusion Leadership Academy. They're also currently supporting our employment initiative. We have a collaboration with an employer, Freddie Mac, in the Washington, D.C. area to create paid internship opportunities for recent graduates on the autism spectrum. HSC Foundation is focused in the D.C. area. They like to fund DC-based issues focusing on youth transition for people with disabilities, so we approached them on that. The Special Hope Foundation funds ASAN to produce toolkits on various issues impacting healthcare outcomes for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We're about to release a toolkit that the Special Hope Foundation funded us to do, focused on organ transplant discrimination. After that, we're going to be doing one on healthcare transition, on the Affordable Care Act, on defining home and community-based services. And our relationship with the Special Hope Foundation, which has been going on for quite some time, is really rooted in our shared interest in doing something to improve the healthcare outcomes of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And the Daniel Jordan Fiddle Foundation is a foundation that focuses specifically on building programming resources and opportunities for autistic adults. And they funded the development of our Empowering Leadership Handbook, a handbook for autistic students and students with other disabilities on systems change. Now, I gave 4 different examples of foundations here. And in each of the examples, I talked a little bit about what that foundation funded us to do, but not just because we thought it was a good idea, but because it was organically linked. It was connected to how that foundation saw its mission, how that foundation defined the work that it wanted to do through its funding. And that's the first question you should ask when seeking foundation funds. What is the mission of the foundation? Last week we talked about distinguishing between activities that are designed to support your mission and activities that are designed to acquire funding in order to fund other activities that are directly related to your mission. And you know, foundations are fairly similar. They have a goal. They have a purpose. They're not just giving money out. Most of them are not just giving money out because it feels good. And so before putting in an application to a foundation, we very frequently spend some time researching on the foundation's website or with other or nonprofit organizations that have received funding from the foundation to learn about their mission, to learn not just how their mission is described in public documents, but how they see their mission, what kind of strategy they're approaching in order to accomplish their mission. And we try and sit down and talk to somebody from the foundation before submitting a proposal. We ask questions like, how much money is your typical grant? If a foundation typically funds, projects worth $5,000 to $10,000, we don't want to ask them for $50,000. It's pretty clear that will mean they will say no. Similarly, if a foundation typically funds projects worth $100,000, we don't want to put together budget that's only going to allow us to do half of what we might want to do if we had more resources. So learning that information up front is very useful. Different foundations will have different priorities around the kinds of recognition that they'll want. Foundations, like other donors, typically want to be acknowledged, and some foundations will have very specific policies about having their logo and name mentioned at various times over the course of the work that they are funding, or elsewhere within your organization, such as on your organization's website or conference, or if you have an annual fundraising event like a gala there as well. And also, what kind of reporting requirements your foundation wants. Most foundations, particularly the better sort, will ask for information about how you spent their money and what you accomplished with it. And so arriving from the very beginning of the process at both a budget but also a series of agreed upon measures that will show that what you're proposing to do is going to accomplish something meaningful is very important. So before we go on to any of the other concepts and any of the other potential funders, I want to take a moment and ask you all, does your self-advocacy group have any foundation funding? And we're going to do another poll right now. It's going to come up in just a second. It's a yes or no question. If you're not sure, just to give your best guess, does your self-advocacy group have any foundation funding? And we're at about 60%, 67%, 73, 87. I'll give folks another 10 seconds to respond. So 64% of you, almost two-thirds, stated that your self-advocacy group has no foundation funding. And I find that, I think, really interesting and something that's worth highlighting here because it's consistent with what we know about self-advocacy organizations and inconsistent with what we know about most nonprofits. Most self-advocacy organizations nationally are receiving funding primarily from a state developmental disabilities council, a state developmental disabilities agency, or another disability nonprofit, and are receiving their funds primarily through one means or another through some form of public funding, some form of government money. This is, well, certainly not unprecedented. There are a lot of nonprofits that rely primarily on government funds. It's a level of dependence on public funding streams that is often very challenging for the self-advocacy movement. If you want to do a lot of things that might be, in some people's eyes, more controversial or might be more focused on what your priorities are as opposed to what your state developmental disability council's priorities are, or if you want to, really significantly disagree with a provider organization that might have otherwise given you money or a state agency, it can be very important to have access to other resources. It can be very important to have access to other kinds of funding. So that's part of why we're really trying to connect you with the broader scope of funders. And just as a quick shout out, next week on our webinar, you're going to have an opportunity to interact with the executive director of the Special Hope Foundation and learn more directly from a major foundation funder in the intellectual and developmental disability community about how the self-advocacy movement can build relationships with foundations. Let's look at our next example of funders. Corporations. Corporations, I think, are very frequently sources of funding for nonprofit organizations. Many nonprofits receive some form of corporate funding of one kind or another. Generally speaking, corporate funding is received largely because of a company's interest in being recognized for making a donation. Companies have ambitions to be seen as good corporate citizens, civically responsible, and so sometimes if they have a relationship with a nonprofit organization, or if a nonprofit organization is particularly well known in the community, they will make donations to them. Now, a couple of questions that are very important to ask yourself prior to seeking corporate funding. First, and if we can just jump to the next slide, what kind of exposure and recognition can you offer? Because typically speaking, unlike foundations, corporate funding, corporations don't exist for the purpose of giving nonprofit organizations money, so they're going to want some kind of exposure or recognition, an acknowledgement in a public place, featuring their logo on a document or in an event. Do you know someone at the company that can champion your request? Just like with foundations, you have a dynamic in which you're more likely to get a yes if you're having a conversation beforehand and talking to a friend of yours at the company, possibly somebody that you may have worked with in the past in some other capacity, or a friend of a friend or a relative who can advise you about what kind of an ask is realistic, what they might want in terms of exposure or recognition, and most importantly, what are they going to want in return? And this is something that I think self-advocacy organizations have to pay particular attention to. Companies have their own interests. Corporations have their own interests, and they're not always the same as our interests, as I think we're all very aware. I think there is certainly value in forming relationships with corporate America. Not only can it be a source of donations, it can also be a way of opening up the door for conversations on disability employment, accessibility, or any number of other things. But it's also very important to realize that they have their own interests, and those interests are different from yours. And so always ask yourself, is this company going to want me to do anything in exchange for this money that I am not comfortable with? And if you are worried about that, have a quiet and polite conversation with them from the very beginning, making clear what you will and will not be willing to do and what your barriers are. And if you think those barriers or boundaries will not be respected, don't take the money. Not every source of money is appropriate for you to take, and it's up to each nonprofit organization to make an educated decision. So there's a lot of value in seeking corporate funding, but there are certainly also some risks, and we want your organizations to think critically about those risks while also not losing access to the opportunities posed by forming relationships with corporate America. So once again, we're going to just pause here and do a quick poll to see if your self-advocacy group has any corporate funding. This is funding from any private business that is not a nonprofit. And if you can just take a moment, answer yes or no. About half of you have voted so far. And we'll give folks another 15 seconds or so. So right now we're seeing the same numbers as we've seen previously. About 64% of you have no corporate funding, 36% of you do. So we're going to close that poll, and then we're going to move on to our next example of fundraising. And that's an area that has all kinds of potential logistical challenges, but can be a lot of fun and comes with, as with any other area of fundraising, its own pros and cons. That's galas and fundraising events. And we interpret this in the broadest possible sense. This can include, a formal gala fundraiser. It can also include a conference, lots of different examples here. The purpose of a gala or a fundraising event is to bring together members of your constituency, various esteemed officials, and celebrate your organization's work, showcase what your organization has done over the year, and most particularly, sell tickets and sponsorships in order to raise money to support your organization's activities. These are some pictures from the ASAN Gala, and I want to highlight that in the right corner, you have a picture of Assistant Secretary for the Administration on Community Living, Kathy Greenlee, speaking and talking about the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network's work, and as is our preference at our events, flapping instead of clapping for applause. And we think that's very meaningful. It gives an opportunity for a senior policymaker to talk directly to our members and our supporters and folks in the community about why they value ASAN and why they value the self-advocacy movement. We also have some examples of awards we gave at our last gala. We have one award, the Chapter of the Year Award, which we awarded to our Washington State chapter, many members of which are on today's webinar. Hello, ASAN Washington State. We have our 2013 Outstanding Ally Award, which every year we give to someone who's been a strong ally to the autistic community. Some of the recipients of that have been Ann Donnellan, Nancy Thaler, Madeline Will, and we also have our award for service to the self-advocacy movement, which we gave this year to Henry Frost. Henry is an autistic teenager who ran a social media campaign for the right to be included at his local middle school. And so the gala gives us an opportunity to recognize some of our successes and our friends and allies. It also has a few other pros, and I want to jump to them next. So the gala is fun, and I think that's really valuable. It's a good opportunity to get public officials to come talk about how great you are, and also simultaneously to send a message to those public officials that you are an organization with a sizable constituency. When a senior policymaker comes to your event and addresses a room full of 100 or 150 or however many people, they get the impression that you're somebody who can turn people out and somebody who has a lot of supporters and that they need to be paying attention to. It's sometimes a good way to give recognition to your donors. So we generally recognize our foundation and corporate donors at the gala. It communicates legitimacy, and perhaps most importantly, it brings in unrestricted funding, money without strings attached. Because generally speaking, gala tickets and gala sponsorships are a collection of a lot of different funding streams, each coming in for a certain amount of money leading to a larger whole. It gives you some amount of money in your organization that isn't earmarked to a specific project, and you can decide to prioritize for what your priorities are rather than necessarily what your funder's priorities are. If there's an advocacy issue you want to take on but you don't have any funding that can be used for advocacy, if there's a project you want to do on a topic like sexuality or relationships or healthcare or any number of other topics that you're having trouble getting a donor to support, a gala or fundraising event can be a good way to bring in some dollars that you decide how you want to use. Now let's talk about some of the cons of a gala or fundraising event. First, it's very expensive, both in time and money. Generally speaking, you do not make a lot of money on a gala at the first time you do it. The money starts to come in after you've done it for typically at least a year or two and have built sort of a regular group of people who come and buy tickets and sponsor. Now, the fact that this is unrestricted money means that sometimes even a little bit of money is more valuable than a lot more restricted funds that you can only use for a specific project. But that's still something to take into account. You're not going to be able to fund your organization's whole budget for the year with just a gala, or at least in most instances you won't be able to. It's also, by its very nature, an exclusive event. Only some of your supporters can afford to buy the ticket or to travel to attend it. We generally make available a number of scholarship tickets for our members to ensure that low-income members of the self-advocacy movement still have the opportunity to attend the ASAN Gala. But you can't give away too many scholarship tickets because you're paying the expenses for the event, you're paying for the meals, you're paying for the room, and you need to make sure that at the end of the day, the organization makes money on the event in order to be able to take that money and put it into its projects. It takes a lot of your time, and that's time you could have been spending on your core mission. I would say for most self-advocacy groups, it's worth doing as an attachment to a conference, or if you can get a ally to help do a lot of the logistics or organization. We were very fortunate. We have some really great allies who volunteered to help us organize our gala, and now we've been doing it for a few years, and it's begun to bring in some money, so we're able to continue to do it. But if we hadn't had a really great ally who had experience with this, it probably would not have made sense for us to start doing a gala or fundraising event. So let's just pause for a moment here and ask, does your self-advocacy group have a gala or other fundraising event? And we're going to do another poll here. We'll give folks another 15 seconds. So once again, and we can close the poll now, once again the majority of you said no, but it was a slightly smaller majority than on foundation and corporate funding. 57% of the groups here have no gala or other fundraising event. That's less than the groups that said they had no corporate or foundation funding. So I think that's interesting. It sounds like at least some of the self-advocacy groups out there are using event-based funding, and if it's working for you, that's fantastic. So let's move to another means of fundraising, and this is a purely fundraising related activity. Most organizations build email lists, and there are a lot of great reasons to build an email list. Number one, it helps you communicate with your supporters and your members, and that's always valuable. People, should feel a sense of ownership in your organization, and the way to do that is by talking to them and talking with them often. Number two, you very often need to mobilize your members, and email is one of the quickest ways of accomplishing that. But number three, email can also be a way of raising money. Here is an example of ASAN's end-of-year fundraising email. We sent this out in late December of last year, and I want to highlight, and if you can just hit the space bar, we should be able to call up a larger version of this. I want to highlight what we said. So we started out by talking about how this has been a time of incredible growth for our organization. We talked about some of the work that we did. We mentioned our Autism Campus Inclusion Summer Leadership Academy, and you notice there's a hyperlink there. It goes to a video in which people can see alumni of our Leadership Academy talking about their great experiences there. We talked about some of our policy work, and we linked to policy briefs we had done on healthcare transition, organ transplant discrimination, and implementation of the Affordable Care Act. So we really reinforced that the resources that we had already received we're being used on good things, and we're being used to build value for our community. But then we talked about what else we're seeing. We talked about some of the concerns members of our community have about prenatal testing, about genetic ethical issues and genetic research and autism. We talked about some of the issues associated with people with disabilities being paid less than minimum wage and segregated and sheltered workshops. So the reason we did this, the reason we talked about all these things that I think a lot of people would find really depressing and are really depressing but are still very important to talk about, is we want to highlight the fact that there is still a lot of work to be done. We're doing a lot of great work. That's what you start with. And then you highlight, we really need your support because there's a lot of work to be done and there's a lot of bad things that are still happening to people with disabilities out there. Then we move to the ask. And we ask our supporters to be a partner with us in trying to change the world for people with disabilities by making a donation if they can afford it. We have a donation platform, it's called Salsa, that lets people make recurring donations, make a commitment to donate every month or every quarter or every year over the course of a long period of time. We encourage people to do that when they can. If they can't, we're happy to take a donation on a one-time basis, or even just if folks want to sign up for our email list and encourage their friends to do that so that they can get involved in action alerts. There are lots of ways for people who can't donate to be involved too. But we really lay out the case in this email about why donation is important, and we do it at a time at the end of the year when a lot of people are thinking about making end-of-year donations for tax purposes. And we'll periodically ask for money over the course of the year, not too often, but there's a really big opportunity to make asks in the December time period because many people make most of their charitable contributions then. Next slide. So a couple of tips for email fundraising. A short, snappy subject line. Make it a brief email. The email I just showed you is probably on the long end for fundraising emails. And you should have a very clear ask. Nobody should have to hunt around to try and figure out why you're talking to them or what this email is about. It should be brief. It should be simple. It should be clear. Build an email list. There's nothing worse than, a group that really only has an email list of the people who work for it and the people who volunteer with it and, maybe a couple dozen people asking those folks for money. Those are the folks who are already giving everything they have to your organization. You're trying to build a relationship with a larger group of people who might not have time to volunteer every week, but do have time to make a donation or be involved in another way. And you still want to send emails to the folks who are already involved, but you don't want to limit it to them. You build a relationship with the people on your email list, and a big part of the way you do that is something you should be doing anyway. Send people lots of emails, not too many, but in relation to the number of fundraising emails you send, you should be sending more emails that have nothing to do with fundraising. They should be about action alerts. They should be about organizing or opportunities or webinars or resources or any number of other things. And again, the reason you're sending those emails out are first and foremost because those are things you want to communicate to your members. Those are things you want to communicate to your supporters. This is a part of your mission. This is why you exist as an organization. But also, when you ask people for money, it's nice if they've heard from you, at some point over the course of the last several months. It's nice if they don't only hear from you when you want something. It's really the same if you're asking a friend or a relative for money. It's considered very poor form to knock on their door after not talking for 6 months and say, hey, how about you give me, $5, $10, $15, $25, $50, or $100? Your choice. not a lot of friends or relatives will respond well to that, and similarly, your supporters don't respond well to that either. Let people unsubscribe, and above all, say thank you. Make sure you send out thank you letters, send out thank you emails, and be responsive in that regard. That can be difficult. That's something that often falls by the wayside. We've often let that fall by the wayside. Recently, we put in place a system to make sure that we remember to say send thank you letters in response to donations. But it's something that a lot of self-advocacy groups have challenges with. And I think it's important to remember, not just because it's polite, but because it encourages repeat donations. A couple of things you should be aware of. In trying to build an email list, you're not just writing these emails down on a piece of paper, and generally speaking, you shouldn't just be, let's move back to the list of email platforms, if you don't mind. In trying to build an email list, you're not just writing these things down on a piece of paper, and you shouldn't just put these in the to or the CC or the BCC field of an email. You want to use an email platform that'll let you keep track of who's opening your emails, that'll let you add people in large numbers and organize and maintain your emails. If you can afford it, potentially an email platform that will link up with your donation platform. And there are a lot of ones out there. Constant Contact is one that a lot of organizations that are just starting out use. It's pretty good. It lets you see who's opened your emails and who hasn't, who's clicked on things in your emails. It's very useful. MailChimp and Campaign Monitor are other ones out there. Emma is another one. Two that ASAN have used, actually three. We started out with Constant Contact. Then we moved to Network for Good, and Network for Good is an integrated email and donations platform that helps nonprofits support their work by connecting their list of supporters with both an email system and a donation system. And Salsa is similar to Network for Good, but it's more advanced and it lets you do more things and also connects to a lot of advocacy software. It also makes it easier for you to mobilize your networks on a variety of issues relating to changing public policy, changing media perceptions of disability, changing how other nonprofits talk about disability. So the level of sophistication that your nonprofit is looking for is going to be dependent on the size of your email list and the size of your budget. Most nonprofits, can utilize Constant Contact and get more than what they need out of it. And I would recommend that you start there. If you have the opportunity to use a more sophisticated system, make sure you get necessary training in order to use it properly. Some of them are somewhat complex, but you can do a lot of interesting things, both for fundraising and various aspects of your organization's mission. So let's take a moment and ask how many of you are using, how many of you have an email list and how many people are on that email list? How many people are on your group's email list? And the options are 1 to 250. And incidentally, if you don't have an email list, feel free to select this as well. 250 to 500, 500 to 1,000, 1,000 to 5,000, and over 5,000 emails on your email list. And we'll give folks another 15 seconds. Take your best guess. Okay. So with 80% of the people voting, we have 83% indicating 1 to 250 people on your email list, and 17% indicating between 500 to 1,000 people on your email list. And, I think what this shows is that most self-advocacy groups have had limited opportunities to develop an email list. And this is something that groups should be thinking about, not just for fundraising purposes, although that's important, but also because it gives you a great opportunity to talk to your members, let them know about meetings, advocacy opportunities, or resources. And it's really the way that most nonprofits are communicating with their constituents in today's day and age. So let's jump to, I think, just two more potential funding sources, and then I think we will wrap up and go to questions. So paid training or speaking opportunities. And you got a picture of a lot of members of self-advocates becoming empowered. I think I recognize Nancy Ward and Betty Williams and a couple of other people talking about issues in the self-advocacy movement. So this is a picture of a training conducted by self-advocates. And there are a lot of trainings conducted by self-advocates today. Many of those trainings are taking place at other people's events, at events run by providers, at events run by DD councils or P&As or universities or parent groups. And most notably, very frequently, you are seeing self-advocates giving trainings or speaking at places that have the resources to pay them. And I think it's very notable that we don't always see self-advocates get paid for their time, even when a family member or a non-disabled expert would. And that's something that I find concerning. Now, what some self-advocacy groups are starting to do, and ASAN has been doing this for a number of years, is to take members of their group that have a leadership role or want to be involved in speaking and ask them if they would be willing to speak on behalf of the group and charge groups that can afford it for that member's time. And let's move to the next slide. Just talk about a couple things that come up in the context of paid speaking. First, only charge what people can afford to pay. It's the same as really anything else. You're wanting to ensure that you are reaching the people you want to reach, and if you can bring in revenue while you're doing that, that's a great opportunity as well. You shouldn't let that pass you by, but don't charge so much that you miss out on opportunities to talk to people you want to reach. Don't forget that public education is a mission activity. It's part of why our organization exists. This is just a way of paying for it. This can be a good way of managing time demands of people asking you to speak everywhere. If you're constantly getting pulled in one direction or another, if your organization is constantly having to send its best people out to spend so much of their time speaking at conferences or events, and they don't have time to do the core work of the organization, charge for their time. Your time is valuable, just the same as the time of a researcher or a professor or anyone else's time is valuable. And organizations that have the resources and want your time should recognize that. And finally, like a gala or other event, it gives your organization unrestricted funds. It gives you some resources that you decide what you're going to spend them on, rather than a donor earmarking them for a particular project or activity. So that can be very useful. And remember, we talked about last week why organizations need unrestricted funds in order to succeed and build their capacity over the long term. So let's just take a moment to do another poll. I appreciate you folks bearing with us on this because it's giving us a lot of useful information. Do you or your self-advocacy group do speaking engagements? And we have three options here. Yes, I or we do, and they're paid. Yes, I or we do, and they're not paid. No, I or we do not. So if you or any member of your self-advocacy group goes to speak at a conference or training and is paid for doing that, select the first option. If you go and speak at a conference or a training and are not paid for doing that, select the second option. And if you don't think people in your self-advocacy group do, speak at conferences or trainings, select the third option. And we'll give folks another, I think, 10 seconds. Take your best guess. We have 80% having voted so far. Okay. So I find these results really interesting. 67%, a majority of respondents, a majority of you said, I do speak at conferences or events. I do speaking engagements. I or my self-advocacy group does do speaking engagements, and they're not paid. 25% say you do, and they are paid, and 8% say you don't. Now, what that tells me is that people are interested in using the time and the expertise and the knowledge of self-advocates, but very frequently they're not interested in compensating their organizations for their time in the same way that they would compensate the time of a non-disabled expert. Now, it may very well be that all of your speaking is being done by groups that have no resources whatsoever. And if that's the case, then, I think there's really no problem in speaking without being paid. Well, sometimes I receive, or ASAN receives, actually, money in order for me to give a lecture or a training. Very frequently, I just do it because it's about reaching the audience that I want to reach. But most organizations do have some resources, even if it's a relatively small amount. And if you can use this as an opportunity to communicate respect for your group, acquire some resources for your self-advocacy organization, and build your capacity over the long term, this can be something very useful and an area that it looks like many self-advocacy groups have available as a means of fundraising. So let's move to the final area I want to highlight in terms of fundraising options, and that's publications. We in the self-advocacy movement produce a lot of resources, a lot of materials about disability advocacy, about self-advocacy, about disability, and the primary purpose of producing those materials is to get them out there and to educate people. But we can also use them as a means of fundraising. ASAN produced something called the Navigating College Handbook. It's a handbook on self-advocacy written for autistic students from autistic adults about succeeding in higher education. And we give it away for free online in electronic form. But for people who want a print copy, we have it available on Amazon.com. And the idea behind that is we want to make sure everybody who wants access to the resource can get it for free. But at the same time, we also want to bring in some resources that will let us produce other resources. This year we're aiming to produce something on relationships and sexuality and another handbook on employment. So by selling print copies and giving away the electronic copies for free, we're at the same time able to raise some money and make sure everyone who wants has access to our resource. So let me just go to the next slide here. In terms of publications, generally speaking, I would recommend you look at print on demand. There are a number of options there. What that means is that you work with a service that prints up copies of your books when people want them or are ready to buy them, so that you don't have to go through the logistical hassle and difficulties of running a warehouse or constantly being sending things through the mail. There are two print-on-demand services we would recommend. One is Amazon's CreateSpace, which we used to use. The other is Lightning Source, which we now use. Amazon CreateSpace gives slightly better margins. Lightning Source it makes it easier to get into bookstores as well as on Amazon and other online platforms. So you want to get your stuff up on Amazon and BarnesandNoble.com. you want to not produce books you wouldn't want to create anyway. You're not a publishing, your organization doesn't exist for the purpose of publishing books. It exists for the purpose of building resources for the self-advocacy movement. And at the end of the day, this is supposed to be a way to get your content to more people and market your books everywhere that you can. So just final poll. Do your self-advocacy group produce publications? And the four options are yes, we do, and we sell them in person. Yes, we do, and we sell them in person and online. Yes, we do, and we give them out for free. And by this, I want you to answer, we only give them out for free. If you give them out for free and you sell them, respond to one or two, select one or two. Or four, no, we do not. And about half of you have voted. Let's take another 15 seconds to get the rest of you. Again, best guess. If you don't know, just select what you think is most likely to be right. Okay. So the responses are once again very interesting. About 9% of you produce resources and sell them in person. 18% sell them in person and online. 36% produce publications and give them out for free, and another 36% do not produce publications. So it sounds like, particularly for that 36% that's already producing this and giving them out for free, that this may be another opportunity for some self-advocacy groups to bring in more resources. So just very briefly, I'm going to ask a couple of questions for you to all think about, and then we're going to go to questions or comments. Next slide. So just critical issues to think about when you're selecting a fundraising method. Does it distract from or reinforce your mission? Is this something that you're only really doing because you need the money and you wouldn't really have any interest in doing it otherwise? Or is this something that really is part of what you would want to do anyway, and you're doing it in a way that'll bring in some resources? Is it sufficient for your needs? You know, if your organization is trying to raise $10,000 for a project, you're probably not going to want to be collecting, quarters, one at a time. On the same time, there are a variety of other mechanisms, and you want to look through and ask yourself, is this going to meet my needs? Is it sustainable? Can you build a program around it, or will it go away after a year or two? And most importantly, is it, well, not most importantly, but also importantly, is it repeatable? Is the activity something you can do and keep on doing it as long as you need the funding, or is the effort of doing it going to take so much out of you that you're not going to be able to do your core work? So having laid out that framework, I think we're going to come to questions. And Stacy, let's see if we can highlight some of the questions that are out there. Okay, so Stacy is going to be posting some of these questions. Go ahead.
So everyone can feel free to type in questions in the question box, and then we can paste it into the chat box.
Okay, so we have a comment that says, here in California, regional centers have foundations that frequently fund advocacy conferences. Okay, that's a great resource. Good to know. What else do we have?
There's an option to raise your hand. So if you raise your hand, I can unmute you. So I'm going to unmute Donna, and your mic should work, Donna.
I'm wondering if you have a specific staff that handles or focuses your marketing and fundraising challenges?
We don't. We don't. A lot of the fundraising I handle personally. Some of it gets handled by other members of our senior staff, but we're a very small, group. So, I think we, I've always taken the perspective that raising resources for the mission is part of the job of the people who are implementing the mission. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, because I'm the only one that's in our office as well, and I just don't know. There's not enough hours in the day to do it all, and so we've given that to our board as part of the. There's a marketing fundraising committee on the board, but they don't have the expertise, and they're volunteers as well. So I think this has been one of our biggest challenges for our sustainability.
It's a huge issue. That's one of the reasons why I strongly recommend self-advocacy groups explore activities that are both fundraising and mission related. We're small organizations. All of us in the self-advocacy movement are small. We don't have the resources we need. We don't have the people we need to do what we want to do. And so we can't spend all of our time writing grants and hoping and praying. We've got to look at things we already want to do or we already are doing and ask, how can I turn this into a fundraising opportunity?
My question.
Hi, I have a question about, this is Trina from San Diego People First. I have a question about when you were talking about the speakers and members of the group going out and speaking to various organizations and such.
Mm-hmm.
How do you actually get them to do that? Because we go out and we do a lot of speaking, and every time that we bring up the possibility of being funded to do the presentation, such as with Regional Center, we're told we're not a vendor organization, and so we can't, they can't pay us.
It's been
and likewise, we're not a nonprofit organization, so they can't pay us.
So it's been my experience that there's usually a way to accomplish this. If you are not yet a 501c3, I would recommend first exploring becoming a 501c3, and the Pacific Alliance has some resources towards those ends. But second, you can acquire a fiscal agent, which is another nonprofit that's going to be willing to, and hang on one moment. Stacy, can we mute Debbie's line because we're getting feedback on it right now? Thank you. You can find a fiscal agent, which is another nonprofit that's essentially willing to hold the money for you and make it available when you request. And obviously you want to find a nonprofit that you trust to play that role. And that can be often a way to get access to resources even while you're still going through the process of becoming a 501c3 or becoming a vendor. But again, in my experience, there is usually a way for people who have money to find a way of paying it to people who have services that are valued. And it's all a question of convincing them first that your services are valued, and second, that they're not going to be able to get them for free anyway, regardless of whether or not they give you the money. Does that answer your question?
Just one.
Okay. I think you may be muted now, but I think that answered your question. If it didn't, feel free to type in. Do we have any other questions? Okay. Any comments, suggestions, anything we might not have covered here or thoughts you might have had? Feel free to raise your hand or type something. Okay, well, hearing nothing, I really want to thank you all for joining us and remind you that our next webinar is going to give you an opportunity to interact directly with the executive director of a foundation that supports groups interested in doing things on healthcare disparities for people with closing healthcare disparities for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We will be working to make these trainings available online in the near future, just as soon as we have them captioned and uploaded onto YouTube. And we will make sure to email all of you to let you know when that happens so that you can share them with your friends and colleagues and let people know about the Pacific Alliance on Disability Self-Advocacy. If you're interested in contacting us, ASAN's website is www.autisticadvocacy.org. My email address and Stacy Milburn, the project coordinator for the Pacific Alliance on Disability Self-Advocacy's email address are both available on our last slide. And once again, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for being a part of the Pacific Alliance.